So the question for today is, does a historical fiction book need to be historically accurate? The other day, I finished The Nightingale by Kristin Hannah, and with tears streaming down my face for how well that ending was landed, I went straight to Goodreads to be confronted with a review that really made me think. The French Teacher and The Nightingale. If you don't know the basics of what The Nightingale is about, it is about two sisters who live in France while the German forces are occupying France during World War II. It's a book about their sacrifices and their bravery and some of the situations they were put in and some of the decisions they had to face. It's a very famous book, I think with 4.5 million copies sold at least, and it resonated with a lot of people, and it's even likely to become a movie. With all that in mind, though, it doesn't mean that it's without historical inaccuracies. When I went to Goodreads, I did find this review from a French teacher, and she said she could not handle The Nightingale by Kristin Hannah because it was too obvious to her how many things were incorrect in the book, and it made it so hard for her to finish reading. She particularly could not handle the anachronisms. And if you don't know what an anachronism is, it's basically putting something in your story that does not fit the time and place. For example, if you gave a movie character from the 1980s an iPhone X, that would be an anachronism. If you gave a Native American a horse before Columbus's arrival, they didn't have horses at that time in that place, so that would be an anachronism. This French teacher pointed out many anachronisms that were in The Nightingale that made her have a hard time getting immersed in the story. Some things she's mentioned is that in this time period, the name of the main character would not have been a name in France. She also mentioned the food cooked in the book was not authentic to the time and place, and maybe even a little bit touristy. Some characters lived in places that they never would have been able to afford, and even the size of the mountain range in the book was inaccurate to the size of the mountain range in real life. She then goes on to say that those are small compared to her bigger issues. One of her big issues with the book is she felt like the French people in the book were not anti-Semitic, even though they were in real life. The distrust and cruelty to Jews was not just the Germans to the Jews at the time, but it was also a lot of the French public to the Jews at the time, and she thought that that was very misrepresented in the book. Another thing she said is that the resistance portrayed in the book, sorry, I'm not even going to try a French accent because I know I would fail at it. Anyway, the resistance in France was portrayed too neatly, and in real life they were more chaotic and they were more risky, and there was a lot more collateral damage than what was portrayed in the book. Also, she mentions that a lot of the actions by the resistance in the book were slightly in the wrong time period. And as a French teacher with really good knowledge of French history, this made the book unreadable to her. Although I don't believe her ending comment is true anymore, she did end her review saying she wasn't surprised The Nightingale was not translated into French because surely the French people would not want to read it. But here's the awkward part. I loved this book. I thought it was beautifully written. The scenes resonated with me, and so did the characters, and it really made me think about the sacrifice that a lot of people would have had to go through in World War II when their homeland was occupied by an enemy force and their power was limited. The bravery of these sisters was very inspiring, and their relationship and the decisions and the situations they were put in were worth thinking about. And this partially might be because I'm American, I'm not French. My understanding of French history is definitely limited, and all of those inaccuracies that were pointed out and all of those anachronisms that were pointed out didn't even cross my radar. I had no idea. And I would say the average American would have no idea of those things either, because I would say that a lot of Americans probably are even unaware at this point that France was occupied by the Nazis during World War II. Even that knowledge at this point seems to be going away. So the little inaccuracies and some of the bigger inaccuracies went right over my head, and I just had a great time with the book. Do we want a historian or a writer? So I think representing history accurately and writing a fiction piece that engages the average reader are two different skills. Now, by no means are these skills mutually exclusive. One person can have both, but that's not necessarily always the case. I think Kristin Hannah, for example, has the talent of being an author that can connect the average person willing to pick up a book to a time and place and feel emotionally involved. Kristin Hannah might not be the preeminent historian of French history, as is likely given there were some mistakes in her book, but she still makes people care about the story. I will say with the French history teacher's take, I do wonder somewhat if there could be more editing when we talk about really famous popular books. I could totally see a situation where you take a Kristin Hannah book that is very masterfully written, and you just run it through the lens of someone who is an expert in that area. If the French history teacher had worked with Kristin Hannah, I would have loved to see what would have come out of that. But we do know that oftentimes some corners are cut, even with very popular books, and the books can still stand on their own, at least in my opinion. And to think about it, who would have picked up a historically accurate version of The Nightingale that wasn't as emotionally touching and wasn't as, in a way, beautifully written? I think some history nerds would have picked it up, but I don't think it would have sold 4.5 million copies, and I don't think it would have become a household name in the historical fiction genre. More than anything, people want to have an emotional connection with characters, they want relatable relationship dynamics, and they want to feel like they are experiencing something as well as learning history. They don't just want to have a historically accurate representation. At least on average, that's what the sales numbers of a lot of books tend to say. And on this topic, if we set the bar for a good historical fiction book really high, a lot of authors who don't feel like they're experts might not touch the genre. You might choose to write a fantasy book or a book where you're able to make things up and no one questions you over a book that might be critically analyzed later on by historians and people who are obsessed with that period of time. And while I do hope more people dabble in the genre, I get where they're coming from when they're worried about getting into historical fiction if they can't make everything in their book accurate. I would say that there's quite a few authors who are successful with a not completely accurate story, Kristin Hannah being among them, but you do kind of have to have that tough skin to be like, I might not get this 100% right, but it was still worth my effort. And do I think that we should try to put some historical accuracy in books? I do, because I love history. And I think that the idea of like an editor with a history perspective would be amazing, especially for books that are meant to portray something real. That being said, I understand that the appeal to the mass audience of people reading these books is not 100% historical accuracy, but it is connection with the characters, and I don't think we should lose that focus. Inaccurate historical fiction is popular. I think popular historical fiction portrayals in culture show us that most popular historical fiction is inaccurate. Bridgerton is inaccurate, and Outlander is inaccurate, even outside of the time-traveling elements of the story. And before we start calling every single historical fiction piece that is inaccurate and written by a woman chick lit, which I keep seeing all over the internet, which is kind of crazy, let's remind ourselves that a bunch of men have written popular historical fiction books that are also not 100% accurate, but are still good books. We can think of The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which is not accurate, The Last Kingdom series by Bernard Cornwell, which is inaccurate, and Shogun by James Clavell is also inaccurate. So before we talk about any historical fiction that doesn't stick strictly to the script, written by a woman, chick lit, and dismissing it as a lesser form of the genre, let's remember there's a bunch of men who do the same thing, and if that's chick lit, I think I just successfully identified what bro lit is. Regardless of gender, based off popularity of stories, it appears that most of the population is more interested in storytelling than they are in historical accuracy, whatever that says about us. It depends on you, not the book. I think your bar for being able to handle a historically inaccurate story says a lot more about you as a person than it says about the book itself. I did not notice any historical inaccuracies immediately with The Nightingale because I am not well versed on French history, but when the French history teacher read it, she couldn't handle the book for those very same reasons. I recently read Code Name Verity, which is also a World War II historical fiction book. In this book, we follow a Scottish girl who is a first officer in the Royal Air Force, I believe, and she is dropped off as a spy into France while Germany is occupying France. She is immediately caught and made a prisoner of war, and the book is basically her confession to the Germans. In many ways, it's good because I kind of like that letter writing approach to books, and because she's trying to withhold information, it kind of reads like a thriller where you learn different things throughout the book, which is really engaging. Also, as another positive, the author is a pilot and she knows her stuff when it comes to airplanes. But overall, I could not buy it. I could not be immersed in it, and I could not fully enjoy it, and there was something off the entire time for me. And that is because the character, although given her accomplishments would put her in her early 20s, sounds like a 14-year-old the entire time. And yes, it's a YA book, but it felt inauthentic to me because I imagine someone who is in a prisoner of war camp and involved in the war would not have an age regression thing where they sound like a baby, but they would probably be more mature than you would expect them to be for their age because of their situation. Also, they gave the women in this book not impossible jobs, but very improbable jobs for the time period, and that also took me a little bit out of the immersive elements of the story. So just like the French teacher couldn't read The Nightingale, but I could read it just fine with no issues, I imagine a 16-year-old girl couldn't read and enjoy Codename Verity with no issues when I could not be immersed in the story because of how unbelievable it felt to me. So in a way, I think it has a lot more to do with you and who you are when you pick up a book than it does with the book itself. This booktuber said something similar about reading Shogun.
I wonder if I was really well read on this, if it would annoy me to death, or whether because it's such an entertaining book that it wouldn't matter. And it's such a riveting story. It's hard to say.
So I guess how much you enjoy the book might partially be tied to how much you know the history of the book you are reading. My final thoughts. It's clear by now that I think historical fiction is meant to be entertaining, and it's meant to bring people into the ideas of history without necessarily being accurate. I do wonder if historical fiction books could gain something by becoming more accurate with the use of editors that are focused in on the history of the time period to make something that is both entertaining and somewhat more accurate than they might be otherwise. That being said, the creative liberty to be able to take something and make it your own and write a compelling story, to me, is always going to be superior to something being perfectly historically accurate. That's just one opinion, though. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this topic. Do historical fiction books need to be historically accurate? Are the ones that are accurate superior to the ones that are not? And is storytelling more important than history, or do we want to use historical fiction to accurately teach what has happened in the past? If you liked this topic, and if you liked the discussion that maybe you're seeing in the comments by now, kind of depends on when you get to this video, I recommend watching my video on how literary fiction lost its power and how genre fiction took over.